There we go. Hiya. Thanks very much for the invitation. This is the most convenient talk I've ever done. It's precisely halfway between where I live and where I work. So I'm based at University College London. I run a research lab, and inside of that I kind of run my own artistic practice, but I also teach. I run a master's program, trying to finish a PhD, a few things. But I'm based in the School of Architecture, and I'm not going to talk a lot about architecture. I'm going to talk about robotics. But in the context of all of that, I'm going to talk about this building just briefly. It's the only building you're really going to see me talk about, because I'm working with industrial robots on this building. Not only working with off-the-shelf robots, but we're actually building our own software, because the software that's used in industry for working with robots is not really suitable always for working with robotics in kind of architectural and interaction design context. So very often we're actually rewriting the code that's used by robotics engineers. But this is a fairly kind of common approach to using robots. This is one of our 11 industrial robots at UCL in the School of Architecture, and we're using it here to route out high-density polystyrene so that we can create molds that allows us to pour concrete elements like this. This is actually working with a building contractor, and a really kind of typical process, but kind of with this robotic piece sort of slipped into it, which allows us to create these samples. And we're showing these to planners, and we've got a few problems with the planners, but once we get past those, we will be, and these are just some of the samples, and looking at different finishes, we'll eventually be building this on Upper Street. Can't show it for too long because it's not supposed to be shown to anybody yet. There you go, and that's it. Anyway, so robots and architecture. The really surprising thing is that the oldest book in architecture, actually the oldest volume, the Treatise by Vitruvius, has a whole book in it dedicated to machines. So architects and machines have a very, very old history. Architects actually were kind of the early machine makers. Fast forward to the entire history of architecture to sort of 1960s, and you've got people starting to imagine, now that they're witnessing the kind of animation of technology, how would these robots might offer us new types of buildings and new futures? And of course, there's these wonderful images produced in London by Archigram that talk about walking cities. There's ideas about deployable architectures and events that might occur around that. Sorry, I'm going very quickly because I put a 40-minute presentation together and it turns out I've got 20. So inflatable architecture, so buildings that are expanding and contracting and changing in response to your needs. How buildings could sort of project themselves out into public spaces, new types of inhabitation, inspired by NASA and sort of new typologies of architecture, transportable and mobile architecture, and all of this underneath there's a wonderful kind of social angle to this, which is about how are we going to live, how are we going to connect to each other. So architects at the time, like Jonas Friedman, were talking about these network cities, and these network cities were physically networked. They were these kind of frame-like structures which made you nomadic, or allowed you to be nomadic, allowed cities to reconfigure. Now, we haven't seen this occur. However, we, of course, are familiar with the world of social media and how that all now becomes much more physical. And so that's about 10 minutes of my presentation I've squeezed down to 3. So that I can talk a little bit more in depth about how this world of connective devices starts to create a new kind of animated built environment. So I'm thinking about architecture in a much more expanded sense. I'm talking about the fact that there are these cars that can drive themselves, that have these incredible LiDAR scanners that allow them to build high resolution information about their environment and make decisions in real time. And you can imagine if every single car is doing the same thing, that's a very high resolution amount of data you can get about any environment, what people are doing, and so on. And it changes the whole way that potentially cities could operate. There's, of course, the idea that we're all familiar with these new kind of types of strange, potentially sort of artificial life forms that might be flying around our cities and sitting on branches and looking in your window. And just all of this kind of new ecologies of technology. And then, some of the most sophisticated robotics companies in the world go and get bought by the most sophisticated information networking technologies and internet companies. And of course, what could go wrong with that? But this is the kind of world of where the technology of robotics starts to become eerily lifelike, like spooky. So I got really interested in that. And I'm not going to show you very much of my own work. I'm just going to show you one piece of my own, which deals very specifically with how we kind of see life in objects. The context of this more in the world of architecture is that the tools that architects use to create 3D models can now drive directly physical models. And so this is the Arduino platform running in a little plugin for something called Grasshopper, which is a parametric program we use for creating models, 3D models. And so it's just really interesting how the physical world and digital world models are crossing over. So we're kind of interested in all of that. Now, I'm going to just show you a little film, which is something that inspired me. It's a film from 1944 by Hyder and Simmel. They're two perceptual psychologists. It's very easy to make things look like they're alive if they have a face and fur or skin. But what's so interesting about these geometric objects is that they irresistibly come to life just by the quality of their movements. And what's really amazing about this is that everybody who watched this video, they did like a big user study. Everybody saw the same story, which is these two triangles fighting over a circle. They perceive this as being an environment that is being occupied. They perceive them with personalities, with goals and intentions. All of that comes from some triangles and circles moving around on the screen. So our mind is geared towards seeing life in things. We project life into anything that will suggest it for us. And so when you're building a world full of robotics and things that can respond to us very directly, it's hardly surprising that we see life in things. So I got a project a few years ago to build an installation for this space. This is the tanks in the Tate Modern. 7 meter tall, 32 meters diameter space. This is what I said to the guys at the Tate. They said, bring the space to life. People have never been in it. We want to want to have this dramatic experience when you walk in. So I gave them this image, and they said, okay. And this is the space. It's an enormous, it's quite hard to truly appreciate just how high this ceiling is. But to build something, I wanted to build something that would travel through that space and become a kind of companion and reveal that space to the public. So to do so, I had to build a 21-meter motorized rail, and then, and this is very much what the lab's about. We build custom machines. So of course, we use off-the-shelf industrial robots, but we actually build our own robots. So on the right-hand side is the quarter-scale Delta robot that we built. It's actually sitting on the rail that was able to travel through the Tate. And you can see with the three arms moving together, it positions this bottom end effector, we call it, in space. And so on the end of the end effector, we put this electroluminescent tetrahedron, and this became the kind of character of the space. All of the rest of the technology disappeared. And so you're left with this glowing tetrahedron floating through the gallery. And people would do strange things. They would kind of congregate it around and sort of, I don't know, every single photograph that I saw of this had another kind of creepy, sinister feel to it. But it was, really, really thrilling to see how people would behave. And I've got a little bit of a film of it. So for me, this is actually like the culmination of about 4 years' work, which I've just compressed into this time. But the idea is that as you walk into the space, it's the first time you've ever been to the tank, so you know nothing about what's inside of it. When you go in, it's completely dark, and you have to walk through this tunnel, which kind of starts to accommodate your eyes. And then as you pop out on the other side, all you see is a single light source floating above, and then perhaps a few people moving around it. And as you get closer, people start to realize that actually it's responding to them. So we had an array of Kinects that were also on the rail, traveling with it, which allowed us to get relatively high resolution information about the gestures and movements of people around it. And if you stood motionless below it, it would actually turn quite abstractly above you, quite mechanically. And as soon as you'd start to move, then it would sort of swing into life and actually start to be much more playful. So it had these sort of opposite, two kind of characters. And people would often be quite meditative and quite calm in front of it. And then children would be the complete opposite. They'd be kind of running around and screaming, and then the machine would mirror that and kind of run around screaming. And this is also very much embedded in my interest in neuroscience, which is actually to do with the way that we project our understanding of others through our own neural activity. So we do there's a kind of a concept of mirror neurons, which maybe some of you have seen before, which is that if I'm talking with my arms crossed, it's quite common that people who are talking back at me will actually also cross their arms. It's a way of actually trying to empathize. So if you're going to build a machine that you want to empathize with people, a very quick way of doing that is for it to kind of respond very directly to mirror your gestures, even if it's in a different form. So, and the image that really kind of struck me from this project, the one that kind of for me was the moment of success, is this one, because I felt that I had achieved something by having this girl want to be lifted up and make a kind of physical contact with the project, to actually want to, I think, reach out in a kind of an emotional way to it. What you don't see just out of shot in the dark are two security guards on a kind of pincer maneuver to pull the child out of the air, because that is essentially a giant spike flying around above people's heads. So now I was going to show you this. This is a video from the BBC, which is the feedback of the public, but you're not going to be able to hear it, I don't think. So if you want to see what the public said, you can find it on the BBC. It's pretty easy to find. And yeah, and everybody talks about it in a very emotional way. Some people describe it as quite creepy. Other people talk about it as being quite friendly. So it was really, it was great. I was so busy with the installation, I didn't have time to ask anybody what they felt about it. So I was really glad that actually the BBC interviewed people. Yeah, anyway, have a look at that. I'm going to actually talk about my lab for most of the rest of the time I've got, which is the Interactive Architecture Lab. We are an interdisciplinary studio. We say that we're interested in the behavior and interactions of things, environments, and their inhabitants. And what we do on a day-to-day basis is we work with artists, we work with architects, we work with creative agencies. This is a project we did with Pretty Bird, Marshmallow Laser Feast, and our client was Famous Grouse. And I use this film just to show you that we're very hands-on. We like to kind of go in the workshop and build things. It's very much how we are able to build custom robots. It's just a lab. And so we're kind of engaged in the projects from the very beginning, and we work. We have an amazing facilities. We have, I think, probably the most sophisticated fabrication facilities in London in the School of Architecture, which is kind of amazing, really. We just got a load of money from the government to build this, and we've got, like I said, loads of industrial robots, water jet cutters, CNC and all of that. So that allows us to do things that you can't really do in many other places. And as a university, our job is to really do new things, to try and sort of test the edges of disciplines. And so we're not necessarily always doing it for profit, we're doing it to learn. So we're allowed to experiment, we're allowed to fail. It's a really lovely environment to be in. And we have students who study with us. So every year we get about 30 students, and we spend a year with them, and they come from all sorts of backgrounds. So it's not architects. It is architects, but it's also people coming from web, from graphics, coming from dance. I've got an amazing dancer this year who's working with the robots very directly. So really trying to create an environment at UCL which welcomes people in from different disciplines to kind of be part of this new world which is coming to life through robotics. So these are projects that happened in the lab. And I'm going to kind of just hop through these videos because they're long and they just kind of give you a sense of how we're working. This is an installation we did for Arup. Arup are, I think, the UK's largest engineering company. They're based in Fitzrovia, and this is for their headquarters. So we built this rig, and we hung 42 robotic winches into their lobby. This is just sort of getting ready. This is software being built by Felix. He's one of my students. This is some of the Arup team working with us. That's some of the lighting designers at Arup who were involved in it, so it was really nice. We got to work with the practice itself that the work was going into, so we got really embedded in their office. And then the final piece is really, it's just it's a 42 balls rising and falling, which in itself for a lot of people would be enough. But actually, for me, this isn't that exciting. I watched the Eurovision Song Contest, and they had about 10,000 of these going up and down. I was like, okay. So I'm never going to beat them on size and money, but the really interesting bit about this project for me was actually the workshops that we run at Arup, where we were doing basically open workshops where we gave the code that we ran the installation with to everybody in the office and said, what would you like to do with this installation? And so we explained the code, we taught people from all over the office processing, and then we worked with them on their code if they couldn't do it themselves to develop different behaviors for the piece. And one of the nicest ones, I think, was some of you will be familiar with the leap motion. So the leap motion is a sort of a little hand tracker, so you can start to, well, you can see what it can do. And we took that out, and then we used that to actually plug that bit of software directly into the installation, and suddenly you're able to puppeteer these balls inside of your very own office. So you could just be at your desk and actually manipulating the entire environment. So it's about democratizing the behavior of sort of technology, because very often buildings don't really allow people to control their actual buildings. So what can we do in that? So it's sort of a research angle. It's quite playful. And we teach processing to all our students, and we generally try and teach processing to anybody who's willing to listen to us. So I'm going to give you something completely different, which is some student work, just to give you a bit of a kind of a view from the opposite direction, which is where we're teaching students mechanics, because people don't often have mechanical training unless they're from particular kind of provinces of the UK. It's actually something that's kind of been pulled certainly out of any education that I ever had when I was growing up, which is a shame, because it's very nice to build mechanical things and understand them. And so students in their early period will be maybe building mechanical things, learning about lighting and control, basic robotics, and then trying to challenge them to think about what the hell is a robot anyway. Maybe it's not mechanical. Maybe the 21st century of robots is actually inflatable. And maybe, depending on the architecture of the capillaries of these air muscles, they might actually behave in different sorts of ways, which would allow you to program the movements of these soft robots just by the way you fabricate them. And so then, perhaps if you could control them, could you start to have strange, soft, walking architecture? And what would be the quality of the light? Because light's very important to architects. What would the quality of the light be if you embedded light inside of something that, as it expanded and contracted, would change its translucency? And I really like these. We didn't actually do enough of this stuff. We will be doing in the future. What it ends up being are these sort of propositional architectural proposals, which are a bit creepy, but at the same time also suggest something you could kind of climb into and curl up and rest inside of. Soft robots are good because hard robots are generally not very good for human bodies. And so it's really thinking about how you might build an architecture that's kinetic but is soft and compliant to the human body. And so this is the sort of proposal that went around it, the idea of these rising and falling elements, lots and lots of material testing. Then just for a bit of fun, we put a EEG brain sensor on it so that you could control the soft machine with the soft machine that's in your head. So that's the graphs, that's the badly made circuit, and then there's this kind of idea that you'd be able to activate this piece of architecture. So this is quite, in some ways, this is quite traditional kind of way of practicing as an architect because it's scale based. Most of what we do is actually at one-to-one. We like building things for real, and because there's a certain kind of education you get from doing things for real. This is a sound-based project, so I don't know why I put it in. So you have to look on our website, but That sound-based project went on to go to the Royal Academy for the Sensing Spaces exhibition. And all of this stuff's on our website, of course, but basically, working as a practice of architecture, but then putting in the sensors, being able to take that information, that got fed to projectors that are on the other side of the space, projecting back into the space in response to that. And so you can kind of see where the world of interaction design and the practice of architecture can start to coexist. And that's really, I suppose, where we place ourselves. So as people walk down, their movements get sensed. This creates this sound piece that gets played into the space. And then on the outside of it, you've got these projections. Anyway, so maybe a couple more projects, because I'm on 20 minutes now. Morphs. Morphs is another student project, but it's just lovely, its story, because it begins with, again, sort of simulation of mechanics and getting to grips with how it all works, and then learning to build a few badly made models. This is great, because this is a robot that walks, but it has no motors in it. It's just a clever use of pendulums and a slope. So can we build structures that don't have to propel themselves in a kind of conventional sense, but actually kind of shift their center of gravity to be able to move? And so this is, again, back in the workshop, developing this proposal, which we are working towards. This is our prototype. This is actually just being walked in the park a couple of days ago. Don't share this with anybody, because we're about to, BBC are about to do a thing on this, and they kind of want to have the, what's the word? Yeah, so I'm showing it to you first, but just don't show anybody else. So this is Morphs, which is a octahedral robot. It's able to shift its center of gravity by changing the length of its struts, and by shifting that, it's able to take these steps. Each of the ball ends, when you squeeze on them, activates them. So it allows you to be able to physically manipulate these structures. And we're kind of imagining all sorts of very practical applications for it, but still our favorite one is the idea that it might be a kind of mobile, interactive playground. And so here's Morphs crawling through Regent's Park. Now, we haven't actually, the reason why we're waiting to do the filming with the BBC is that we're actually trying to organise children. We need children for this to really talk about the idea of it being a playground. And I don't have any children, so so BBC are kind of getting some for me. But we just, but it just happens to be at Regent's Park that we were very lucky. There were some kids there, and as soon as it starts moving, like you see one kid see it, and he's like, "What is that?" Yeah? And then there's kids with these amazing faces. So we're very excited about that. We have to do a proper film, but I'll show you the Kinetic Art Fair as well, which is just. We bring our work out into the world. We'd like to share it with people and see how people feel about the work. So I've got 3 different kind of robotics projects. One of them is Morphs, which I've just shown you. This is a little space we had at the front of Kinetic, and the first project is called Eye Catcher. This again is a student project. This is a frame that sort of magically can move around a little. And if you want to know how it works, it's all online. But we're using very kind of Victorian techniques to do quite a lot of this. Inside the frame is a magnetically responsive fluid called ferrofluid, and behind the wall we're magnetically controlling the eyes of this frame with the magnets, and that's all kind of robotically manipulated. The frame itself has a small embedded camera, which means that it can read your facial expressions, and it mirrors them back to you. So again, we're using the same kind of technique. That was the internal structure that you just saw spinning of Morphs, Spiracle Robot. We call it Bump because we can't get control of it. It just kind of careers around crashing into things. It's about as strong as a child, equivalently, so it's quite interesting watching them kind of battle it out. And we're now building, I'll show you in a minute, we're building a big one, a really big one. And then there's Morphs as well. And people, what's nice about Morphs is that the balls that are on it are really squeezable. You want to squeeze them. So people intuitively actually start to see the response in it and start to understand how to play with it. We're building a 3 meter tall 3 meter long strut version of this for a exhibition, not an exhibition, for a festival in Exeter. We're going to build 5 of these that crawl through the city from different directions, come together and create a kind of ultra megamorph. And that's next June. I'm wrapping the struts in electroluminescent sheet, the same thing I showed in the Tate, because it's magical. It's very beautiful. Our next ball, just something to, if you keep an eye on this, you'll see this in a few months' time. This is the structure for our new Spiracle Robot, and what we're trying to do is we're looking at the idea of mobile architecture, but in response to living systems. And so we've been working with an artist collective to sense the well-being of plants, which involves us sticking electrodes into them, but basically measuring the what's the potential? It's the ionic differential, something I should remember, but electrical difference across the plant itself, which allows you to measure its well-being. So it gets a bit more sunlight, a bit of water, it's happier. This is the general, slightly fuzzy science that we're applying to this. The idea is that if you have a whole garden, you can tell which members of the garden want more sunlight or less sunlight, and so on. And so we're building a spherical robot mechanism which will allow the ball to shift its weight, housing that. Then we're putting a garden around that, which is the structure. This is evolving quite a lot to something else right now, but essentially we build a garden around that sphere, then we house that, and we sense the well-being of the plants, which allows us for the plants to democratically drive the spherical architecture that they live inside of. So essentially, it's a garden that drives itself around looking for sunlight and water and shade, depending on the conditions of its environment. So it's a mashup of a lot of things we're interested in, which is how a lot of projects happen. And one day we're going to hopefully have it driving around Trafalgar Square. We'll see. I think that's it for today. That's it. Thank you very much.
I wonder how much science fiction and the imagination of people like 30 years ago has influenced all the things that are happening today?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, I don't know. Yeah, of course. Science fiction, I've grew up on science fiction, I love science fiction, so I suppose it probably does, but I've never made a direct connection between it. I would say that there's always a lot of people thinking about robotics and thinking about humanoid robots, because that's sort of a natural human instinct to want to remake itself. It's a lot of what I think drove early automaton makers. And it's actually the history of people trying to make human beings that led to a lot of the developments in robotics that have brought us to where we are today. So the Japanese built a lot of karakuri dolls, which basically meant that they were the best mechanical designers in the world for building kind of robotic arms. And there's lots of histories of people wanting to build human beings. So I guess one of the things I find fascinating about science fiction is it always projects the technology into human form, or often does. And I actually think we should be thinking about robotics as non-human form, but actually much more embedded into things that we're wearing, or the environments that we're in, or the objects, the kind of possessions that we own. And so I think in a way science fiction, although it's got many things right, and it's kind of spooky, we have driverless cars, and drones and all these kind of things, that, hoverboards, and it feels like science fiction is becoming fact. At the same time, I think science fiction has kind of got it a little bit wrong, in the sense that it thinks about robotics as being about human beings, and I think it's actually much more distributed and more interesting than that.
Question. Beside your interaction, you're using the word respond, interact, mirror.
Yeah.
So you're on the side of deciding a response to something.
Yeah.
So I do this and it goes left.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So do you discuss proacting?
Yeah.
As a sense of the robot decides if the user has bad personal hygiene,
Yeah.
you will not react
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah.
Or you will just roll over them and kill them.
Yeah.
So if you have that kind of choice, so it's proactive, not responsive.
Yeah, totally. I think this is really, really interesting, and I didn't have time to present any of the work that we've done today on.
One. I was like, it's cool.
Yeah. Okay, so the next talk will be on artificial intelligence, and yeah, I mean, basically, artificial intelligence is the other half of a talk on robotics compared to the whole world of movement and materials, and actually, the relationship between the materials and the objects and the intelligence is completely. You can't really disconnect them, although I've tried to do that today. I've done projects, my earliest projects that helped me realize that people animate things when they start to move were completely about building machines and environments that evolve their behavior in response to human occupation. So a project I did called Performative Ecologies was a series of machines that were in an environment that when they were born at the beginning of the exhibition, didn't have any behaviors, apart from they had this kind of tail that would kick with light, and they had these cameras that they could detect the level of attention that they were getting from people in the room, and there was 4 of them, so they would compete for the attention of inhabitants of the space. And I hadn't programmed with any behavior, I just gave them the instincts to want to attract attention, and so they learned. They were a little bit like newly born puppies or children or whatever that are kind of flailing initially and then start to organize behavior with certain strategies. And the thing that was really interesting about that project for me was that I put it into a gallery in Sao Paulo in 2008, and it was there for 3 months. 250,000 people interacted with it in that time. And when I came back to see the exhibition at the end, because I had to kind of pack it away, I was super excited because all 4 of the machines had evolved their own characteristics, and the people who worked in the gallery and looked after them every day had given them each individually different names, right? And that was the moment where I went, okay, so nobody's actually interested in the artificial intelligence of this system. All they're interested in is the personality and the character of them. And then I went and sort of did a deep dive into puppetry and animation and perceptual psychology. And that's what my PhD is about, basically. But so I was very much more interested in the question of the difference between a reactive and an interactive environment early on. And when I call it the Interactive Architecture Lab, I mean truly interactive. I mean I want environments to adapt and respond to people, not to just be predictable. So that's why it's that. And I have a critical position on that term interactive. But just for kind of brevity today, I've just gone for the kind of kinetic emotional aspect of the work, but totally equivalent to that is questions about learning and adaptation and true interaction. Yeah.
I have a question. There seems to be done a lot of effort in democratizing robotics from a very early stage, so things like Technology Will Save Us or Kickstarter being flooded with Arduino projects. Yeah. What is your view on that?
Well, I think it's brilliant, and I think that the educational system at university level is struggling to keep up with it. So, and that's partly because, well, I would say that the world of interaction design in many schools has been playing with Arduino in a very kind of, in a sort of Arduino on a desk and a little bit of a light and a sensor, and everybody gets a kick out of it, and then they maybe build a little thing there and it works, and then they go back to learning how to build websites or whatever the other aspects of the education they're getting are. But I haven't found any other courses apart from our own, the one that we're running at UCL, which basically say, well, the interaction technology will come later. Learn about materials and making and creating environments. Learn about architecture, because architecture actually has a whole contribution to make in this field. I don't think we're dealing anymore with interaction of objects. I think we're dealing with the idea that our environments are going to be responsive, and so we should be thinking much more architecturally about interaction. So my feeling is that we should, I think that the whole world of Arduino is brilliant. I think that lots of people out there with electronic skills and programming skills, but there isn't so much there's no bridge to bring you into the world of spatial design and working with materials at scale, and that's what we're kind of trying to do. And I think that's going to be an expanding part of it, and that should, I hope, only help to feed more into the kind of the world of Kickstarter and sort of open hardware projects.
Yeah. Last question. Yes.
You mentioned in the introduction about anti-disciplinary practice.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah. So architecture is a really good discipline to be, in the sense that it doesn't really require you to practice in a particular way, but I work with people in robotics, and they're always talking about what the paper is going to be at the end of the project that we're doing, and working with perceptual psychologists again, and they're a very structured way about looking at how they produce work in their discipline. And then I also work with people who would call themselves artists and or designers or whatever. And I always find that there's always, with every project, particularly when you see arts and science projects, there's always going to be a power struggle between the artists on one side and, say, the scientists on the other. I don't like to make these distinctions, but just to explain my point. And if you do an art science project in an art school, then the scientists lose out quite often. They're kind of treated as kind of helpful, but stay out of our way. And if you do an art project in a science department, I think you're kind of looked down upon a little bit by the discipline. Architecture is great as a discipline or as an environment because it kind of welcomes everybody in and gives them equal, an equal footing. And so, in a sense, it's anti-disciplinary, and I would argue, at least in the way that we're practicing. We don't teach our students anything about drainage or foundations or about fire escapes or all of the other things that you need to teach in an architecture school. I let other people do that. By the time they get to my master's program, all we're doing is completely open, kind of student-led projects that could be more down the world of dance, or it could be more down the world of psychology. I don't mind, but just trying to create an environment that doesn't have a bias towards a particular approach is kind of what I call anti-disciplinary practice. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. We'll be sticking around if you want to come say hi and ask more questions. Feel free to do so.
Yeah,
Thank
happy
you so
to.
much.
Thank you, guys. Cheers. Thank you.